everyone. Welcome to VRIC Media, your most trusted voice in metals and mining. I'm your host, Darrell Thomas, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing Jennifer Shaigec. How you doing today, Jennifer?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Darrell?
I am doing well. Glad to be back with you. You know, we've had you back on in November. Then we were also on some panels together at the conference, and so it's good to have you back on the show. And so I want to start with a couple of things, a couple of questions, because I was reading your recent publication from your newsletter, and many of us have gotten the commodity supply and demand story. So many of us understand it. We study it, all of those things. But I'm curious in your thoughts on, like, what are some other major shifts that investors should be thinking about when positioning their portfolios?
Well, another one of the things that I sort of wrote a bit of a white paper on in February was soft nationalization. And that's been a concern of mine for a little while now. And I think it's not outright nationalization, but it's more government investment in a lot of these projects is really strategically, it's altering the landscape. So taxes, royalties, I think we'll see take a bigger share going forward. And I'm very cautious of that in Canada. I've been watching some of Mark Carney's policies, and I'm pretty concerned about that in the future. So just keeping an eye on that for now. And then the impact of CBDCs as well. So there's been the pilot projects that have been done through the Bank of International Settlements, and their timeline was to implement some of these globally by 2027, which coincides with the Davidson window. I think you've probably heard me talk about that before, but in military circles, that's referred to as kind of the time frame in 2027 where China and the US will likely have a conflict. So all of that's pretty concerning.
hmm Yeah, so CBDCs, I don't want to spend too much time there, but I mean, you piqued my interest because I saw a recent article with Visa and some other big, huge companies partnering to launch a major stablecoin. And so curious in how you're seeing these CBDCs and stablecoins. Are they pretty much the same thing, one and the same, or just curious in your thoughts there?
So I don't follow Bitcoin, which is crypto, too closely, but stablecoins and CBDCs are definitely different. So CBDCs are basically government backed money, and with stable coins, it's backed by something, be it gold or US treasuries or something like that. So it's different in that Trump, as soon as he was inaugurated, he passed an executive order that stated that it was prohibited to create CBDCs within the United States, and that they'd be going with stable coins. And so I'm waiting for some more legislation on that, because I think they're working right now on the Clarity Act, which speaks to crypto. And then the Genius Act is about stablecoins. And there's been some speculation that he might just revalue gold on Independence Day. And I'm not sure. I'm thinking it might have something to do with a gold-backed stablecoin or something to do with stablecoins. So I'm very curious. I know Scott Bessent was making a comment too about July 4th. So I'm eager to see what happens.
Yeah, yeah. So definitely a few days away. Currently recording this on June 30th, so definitely I am excited to see what comes out. I'm curious to see what comes out of that. I don't want to say excitement because it could be a train wreck. Who knows? Curious in your thoughts on the Middle East conflict. So there was a lot of trade that was disrupted. You write about the middle corridor is becoming strategically important. And so just curious in your thoughts and if you could expand more on this thesis about the middle corridor and why is that so important?
Absolutely.
Well, what
So,
is it and why is it so important?
okay. I had a few slides, more than a few, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
prepared. I think it would help people to better understand. But once people are aware of the Middle Corridor and its impact in the Middle East conflict, and also I think it has a lot to do with the war in Ukraine, It really puts a lot of things into perspective, including our relationships with Canada, the United States, the EU, China, and I think the corridor is just something that people haven't discussed. Most people, if you ask them if they know much about Armenia, they'll mention Kim Kardashian, and that's it. They don't really know much about the country. And I think it's probably the most important country in the world right now. So if you don't mind, I'll share some slides and
Yeah, yeah,
explain that.
yeah. Let's see them.
So this area of the world has actually been kind of pulled in all directions for millennia, not just centuries even. But in the 1870s, the European oil market was really dominated by the Rockefeller Standard Oil. And then the Nobel brothers of the Nobel Peace Prize actually discovered oil in the Caspian Sea. So Baku is in Azerbaijan. And there was some conflict there with Russia and the Rockefellers and the Europeans over oil there. And so eventually, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred, and basically Russia blocked access to oil in the Caspian Sea all the way till 1991 when the Soviet Union fell. So it used to be called the Throne of Oil, and it's yet to be determined exactly how much oil is there, but there's a lot of speculation. In 1998, the U.S. State Department had a document that they figured it was more than in Saudi Arabia, to give you an idea how much
Hmm.
oil actually is there. So I think people aren't aware of it just because, it was landlocked for so long. But
A quick
it,
question on that.
yeah.
So, is this the type of oil? So, like, I've heard of like the heavy crude in Venezuela, and then the oil that comes out of the Middle East is like, a lot more lighter, easier to process and such. Do you know if this oil, what type of oil is there?
I don't. That's a good question. This
Okay.
is something I've been looking at the history of it for the last, a month or so, ever since I came across the importance of it. But that's not something I've looked at. Now, it's not just in the Caspian Sea. There's significant reserves onshore as well in
Hmm.
these countries. And there's natural gas too. So it's just a vast resource. And there's a lot of critical mineral supply there too. It's funny how all of this, I've done a lot of work about changing cycles in history, civilizational cycles, generational cycles, imperial cycles. And always natural resources underpin all of these, and gold in particular, and silver. But I wanted to go back all the way to 1971 because I think that a lot of this began around this time. So when Nixon closed the gold window, and the United States could basically print money with abandon, it sort of set them on this inevitable path where debt would become at some point just unbearable, and it would collapse. But the thing was, I love reading this Office of the Historian. I'm a bit of a nerd on a Friday night. It's just fascinating to read these conversations between Kissinger and Nixon. But this in particular, I came across this one, and I look at the quote there on the bottom. The Europeans will be tempted to set up a new gold-based currency bloc. Now that's, we were talking about CBDCs, and there's been a lot of speculation about them being backed by gold or by metallic standard. But this quote here, their scope for doing so will increase in the future as their oil deficits diminish. So in 1971, basically the States was set on this path of money printing, not backed by gold. And the fact that this Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs made this comment was very interesting to me. So I think that Europe kind of saw the writing on the wall. And in 1988, they created the European Central Bank. And then they have been adding countries to the euro area. Now, this is key in my opinion. So Trump on Easter Sunday in 2025. That is his tweet there on the top right. The golden rule of negotiating success. He who has the gold makes the rules. And so most people assume that the United States has the most gold. If you look at, that's from the World Gold Council there, official gold holdings, you can see the States has 8.13. I need my glasses on.
Yeah,
And then,
small.
yeah, and then, but as a collective group, as a bloc, the Euro area, have a look at that stat above there, has a lot more. And it's always kind of been my view that this is what they were headed for, especially after I came across that quote about a gold-backed currency via a European bloc. So back to the Caspian Sea. In the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, a former superpower was replaced by these 15 independent countries. And so that's very important going forward. If people watch the geography there, I don't believe I put this in a later slide, but one thing I've been watching that I don't think people pay attention to when they discuss central banks buying gold is which banks. And one of the largest buyers of gold has been the State Oil Fund of Azerbaijan. Not the country, not their central bank, but the State Oil Fund. And they bought more gold than China in the last year or two. So I've been watching that. Turkey, Poland, Turkey sold some recently, but all these countries, Kazakhstan along this middle corridor, have been the largest buyers of gold. So that's been interesting to me. Europe created the European Central Bank in 1988, but then in 1993, after the Soviet Union fell, they created this Troika, which was initiated in Brussels in 1993. It was financed by the EU and aimed at the development of this transport corridor, the middle corridor, basically. And then you can see the countries there. And later, 1996-98, Ukraine and Moldova joined this organization. But in 1994, there was something called the Contract of the Century that was signed. And it was this international consortium of oil producers. I think there were 11 of them. And it was to produce oil in the Caspian Sea, and BP would be the largest operator there.
Yeah, that's British Petroleum, right?
That's correct. So in 1994, they signed this contract, and then in 1997, it went into production. So 1997, it's interesting when they went into production that China started to make some investments in the Central Asian countries. And basically they wanted in on some of this action. So they started building infrastructure. Their Belt and Road kind of began back then in that Trans-Caspian corridor. Now in 1998, the New York Times had this article. I love looking at their archives, but it was really interesting what they said in there, because this is something when I came across the whole middle corridor and the importance of it, that they spoke to that in this article back in 1998, that it would have profound economic and geopolitical consequences, and that there would be all these different countries kind of lobbying over these trade routes in the area because it was so valuable. So I'm invested in a small mining company, an explorer in Armenia. And I'd been talking to, this is kind of how I came to discover a lot of this, because I didn't know Armenia myself. But the CEO of this company had told me that the second largest U.S. embassy in the world is located in Armenia. Now, that's not by square footage, it's just the land package. But the largest is in Baghdad, and the third is in Beijing. So that tells you, it's a very, very important country. So that embassy was built in 2005. And if you look there, they have an estimated 2,000 to 2,500 American diplomats in Armenia. And just for comparison's sake, in Russia, before they were expelled, the total number there was 455. So obviously the United States sees something very important in Armenia. And I believe the population there is less than 3 million people. It's a very small country. So I think that its importance is really underestimated. But then I was talking about the debt and how Nixon closed the gold window and basically set the US on this path. So I love that image from Visual Capitalist on the left because 30 years of central bank gold demand. It's really a striking visual when you see that central banks had been selling gold for decades. And then in 2008, around the time of the GFC, they switched and became net buyers. And that is about the time when US debt became structural. And then on the right, you can see that that's when the holdings of US treasuries peaked, is around the GFC. So it's kind of like that was the point at which things were irreversible, and rivals of the US had been waiting for that moment and reversed course. So then in 2014, this is kind of where I think, and myself, I was guilty of this. I assumed that most of the conflict potentially, and the rivalry was really just between the US and China. But then I started noticing that Europe had partnered quite a bit with China, including our prime minister has some agreements with China, seems to be very keen on doing business with them, and has said that our relationship with the United States is over. So in 2014, the number of freight trains from China to Europe increased dramatically. And you can see that Guardian article on the left from 2014. And it's the first cargo train from China to Madrid, the longest rail link in the world. So they've been building this infrastructure, China to Europe, but it wasn't just that. European hubs are fueling RMB internationalization. So 2014 as well, Europe started doing this payments in renminbi. And you can see there, UK leads Europe, 123.6% growth in 1 year, followed by France, then Germany, Luxembourg. And since July 2013, European payments directly exchanged with China and Hong Kong in RMB increased by 105%, showing a considerable upward trend in RMB usage. So this is about the time that the partnership between China and Europe really began. So to counter that, in 2015, the United States came up with this C5+1 group, representing the US government, and then these Central Asian governments, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. I just call them the stands. But what interests me sometimes, and maybe I do it too often, but I like to read between the lines a little bit. And the part that I have bolded there, founded on respect for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of all countries. So they're including the United States in that. And I think they kind of started to see what I'm seeing now happening. And there are concerns about sovereignty now regarding central bank digital currencies. And I really think that's why Trump has said that America's going to go with stablecoins, while the rest of the world is going to these CBDCs. So 2017 to 2022, along comes Russia. And they kind of had their own C5+ program where they established allied relations with some of these countries, all the stands again. And they signed a contract there for joint efforts and multifaceted cooperation ensured. And you can see on the right there, the European Economic Review had a piece about the trade between Russia and those countries. From 2017 to 2022, it really surged dramatically. So I'm sure all these other rivals were not really keen on that happening, with Russia increasing their trade in this area that's really coveted. 2022, well, what happens? Russia invades Ukraine. And who's been supporting Ukraine? The US and the EU. Could be just, a different conflict, but I don't think so. And so I've been trying to make some comparisons here to see, or looking up, researching articles to see if somehow the war in Ukraine is a part of this. And that's something that I just started digging into, but it does definitely look that way amid the war in Ukraine, um, major geopolitical realignments in that area,
Hmm.
China's westernmost borders, etc. But yet, it is here that the outlines of a new world order can be glimpsed. So, really, I think if people aren't having the discussion about the middle corridor, they're missing a huge part of the picture.
So the basis of what you're saying, and I appreciate all of this research. You're giving us a lot of context. I mean, you're doing some like investigative journalism or something like that, here. Um, so are you saying that the middle corridor is pretty much the foundation for like a new world order, new global order?
Yes. So, in a nutshell, and I guess once I'm done with the slides, I hope I would think people would see it the same way, and I'm certainly open to disagreement. But the way that I see this is back in 2008, and well, way back to Nixon closing that gold window and the inevitable, money printing path and debt, that at one point it would become unsustainable, which it did in 2008 when debt became structural. And that's when all of these central banks started to buy gold. And then I think the writing was on the wall at that point. And so that is why Europe and China formed this partnership. Now, I think I'm going to get to this in a slide and maybe
Hmm.
a couple minutes, but there was a very interesting report from the Dubai government. It was, what was it called? Oh, The Future of Trade, Rebuilding Through Rupture. And they discussed, it was a little frightening because I don't think that the middle core is necessarily the entire picture, but it's a big part of it. But this piece from the Dubai Commodity Commission discussing this rupture in trade referred to the changing demographics. And they weren't just talking about the debt levels, they're talking about the whole center of gravity shifting over to Africa, Asia, Middle East, with rising incomes and urbanization, all of that changing. And I think the picture really is that we're going to see this rupture where trade shifts to a different part of the world. And this is why I think Trump really wants to maintain that sovereignty and stick with stable coins when the rest of the world is going to these central bank digital currencies and not have that imposed on America. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, totally makes sense. I'm curious, and how does which I want to let you finish the presentation because this is great. But I'm curious in your thoughts on the BRICS and how does that kind of play into this equation? I imagine some of those countries may be a part of the BRICS or whatnot. So just definitely want to get to that.
Sure. Okay. So Canada, I had mentioned the United States had in 2005 their second largest embassy. Canada just opened one in 2023 in Armenia. And what was interesting too, all of these little things that I've been watching happen was that Mark Carney went on a trip to Armenia to join the European Union. I think I might have that coming in another slide because that just happened recently. But back in the early 1900s, when I was talking about the Rockefellers and the Nobels and the competition with Russia, back then they called it the Great Game. And now they're calling it a new Great Game. And they're talking about this rivalry between these emerging major powers. That's a quote that I pulled from that Hudson Institute piece, including Russia, the US, China, and the EU as they compete for influence and resources in that region. So then in 2025, May, Iran actually signed an agreement with these countries as well. And it said most of the changes here were scheduled. I underlined it there for the second half of 2025. But Iran kind of gave them a pretty good arrangement there. You can see I have some of the terms there on the right. entire commodity nomenclature. But I couldn't help it. I had to throw in a Kim
Mhm.
Kardashian because yeah, most people, if you talk to them about Armenia, they'll mention Kim Kardashian, and that is the extent. But really, honestly, I think it is. I call it Middle Earth, not Middle Corridor. And historically, I mean, I believe it's referred to even as the birthplace of Christianity. So there's just been, um, millennia of things happening there. But this was really interesting. I think a lot of people assumed when Donald Trump brokered a peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan that he was just out to get a Nobel Peace Prize. No, no, there was a lot more to it. So at the time, in August 2025, it was basically just this MOU. So they initialed this agreement but didn't actually sign it. So they had to wait, and I'll get to this in a second, for the election in Armenia, which just happened in June. So August 2025, Trump brokers this peace agreement. But then in January 2026, the White House announced this framework for the Trump route for international peace and prosperity in the region. And I haven't spoken to a lot of people that are aware of this TRIPP agreement, but basically the U.S. government signed an agreement granting the U.S. or U.S.-backed consortium exclusive development and operating rights to the corridor for 99 years. And so in that agreement, it's all about building infrastructure, fiber optic cables, all kinds of things. And then it's interesting to note too, when I say people don't really talk about this region of the world, that Azerbaijan, who Armenia and Azerbaijan, that's why Trump brokered the peace agreement. They've had conflict there for a long time, and they actually supply Israel. Um, they're the largest single energy supplier to Israel. So I thought that was interesting as well. But that state oil fund from Azerbaijan, one of the biggest buyers of gold, they actually signed in January a $1.4 billion cooperation agreement when they were in Davos. So same thing for building infrastructure. And in that agreement, they talked about how it would benefit the entire region for some time to come. So that was January that some of those events occurred. And then lo and behold, February, the United States goes to war with Iran. And Iran, again, had signed that agreement with those countries to cooperate for the second half of 2025. So I think there's something to this middle corridor that maybe, there's connections people just haven't made yet. So then Iran, in response to the United States strikes, they actually blocked food exports to a lot of these Central Asian countries. And they were hit with these immediate shortages, and it's been a pretty terrible experience for them too. So, when you think of the Iran war, it's not just Iran and Israel. There's a lot more going on in that region. And then New York Times had this article about Canada and the EU, and how Mark Carney, when he went to join the EU in Armenia, just before the election. So the election was early June, and in early May, he went on a trip to join the EU there to have this meeting. And he was the first non-European leader to attend one of these meetings. So again, there's a lot going on in that region that I don't think people are paying attention to. So then early June here, they had their election. And you can see the European Parliament said there were high stakes there. And again, who cares about Armenia? We should be. Obviously, the European Parliament is. So the incumbent won the election there. Now, you would think, and I, talked to the CEO of the mining company that I'm invested in. We agreed it was a positive in that the incumbent is business friendly, friendly towards the West. But that peace agreement that was initialed, in order for that to proceed, they would have had a significant, I think it was over 2/3 majority in the election. And then they could vote, have a referendum to change their constitution. And that's what they needed to do in order to finalize that peace agreement. So really, the fact that they didn't get this, first of all, the Russian candidate did not win. The EU sent people to they had international observers go and monitor the election there. And they had that meeting a month prior that Carney went to. But this election, in my opinion, really went in the EU's favor, not the United States, because they cannot now finalize that peace agreement, and not in Russia's favor. So it was interesting that it really went in the EU's favor. So then June 12th, right after the election, really, that article late on the evening of June 11th, is when Trump declared that the peace deal was near with Iran and that the Strait of Hormuz would reopen. And then the Iranian foreign minister went on state television and he said, Iran is the winner of the war with the United States. So I think Iran was kind of happy that the election in Armenia did not go that way either. And all of these things, maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe I'm just overthinking things, but I really don't think so. I think there's a lot, connected to all of this. So here we are, present day. And this is kind of where I just want to sum up my thoughts on it. You go back to that comment back in 1975. The Europeans will be tempted to set up a new gold-based currency bloc, and their scope for doing so will increase in the future as their oil deficits diminish. So, if Europe were to secure Caspian energy, critical minerals from these Central Asian countries, and then secure trade routes with China, where they bypassed Russia and Iran, and they had this European gold bloc where they held more gold than the United States, there's no more need for the petrodollar. And that really is the United States' advantage as an empire financially with the petrodollar. So I really think that we're about to see this rupture or significant change across the globe. And this is where it's all coming from. So just to note, when I presented in Vancouver, I had this slide as part of my presentation because I was starting to see some of this then. Because, like I said, initially I thought it was all about China and the United States. But then I became, more convinced that somehow the EU had its own plans that we just hadn't quite discovered yet. Does that all
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. Curious in, the fact the European Union, I mean, it's a col collaboration of many nations, and some of these nations don't agree on certain policies. I mean, especially when it comes to like the European Central Bank, and I'm hearing some stories about the EU being severely fractured and potentially could be dismantled at some point. And so, what's kind of like your response to those types of claims?
I personally hope so. And I don't want to see what I think is going to happen. But I don't think so. I think that they have made significant inroads. It was interesting at one point, the Italian, I want to say prime minister, I'm never sure if they're prime minister or president, but she had talked about Italy keeping the gold for Italians. And she had a little bit of a war of words with Christine Lagarde, head of the European Central Banks, because Christine Lagarde has been all about securing the gold from all of these countries. And I noticed that the EU actually added 43, I think it was 43 tons of gold in January. And, overall, if you looked at their monthly ads, it was very, very little. So I was curious, where did that come from? That's because Bulgaria joined the EU in January. So with every country that they add, and Armenia is one on the list, Armenia has applied to be part of the EU. Once they're accepted, any gold that they have, Azerbaijan perhaps too. Azerbaijan, as I said, was one of the largest buyers of gold. once they're added to the EU, that all collectively becomes part of that gold bloc. So I think they're
Hmm.
building power slowly. And I noticed the Prime Minister of Finland too, or President again, I'm never sure. He was discussing how happy he was that the basically America's preferred candidate lost the election in Hungary. And you can tell that all of these elections that go their way are just adding to that power. So I maybe it could happen that the EU is dismantled, but I don't think so. I think, as I said, they're growing in power.
Hmm. And so Armenia being added to the EU, would that add some layer of energy security based on like what you presented earlier?
Mhm. So, in order really for that region to function effectively, I should add, I have a slide of these two kids that were fighting, and their mom put them in one giant t-shirt and said, "This is our get along shirt." And I think that's the case with Armenia and Azerbaijan, is the only way for the middle corridor to work is for those two countries to have some kind of agreement to cooperate. And it's not just them too. There's Georgia in there as well. So I think that's the next country that might have an election coming up. I haven't looked in depth at Georgia yet, but that's the impression I got is Georgia's kind of next on the list for the EU or whoever to kind of get them on their side to proceed with all the development there.
Okay. And what are your thoughts about the EU? Like, to my knowledge, and this could be just, Western propaganda or whatever. Um, but Trump has come out and said like, hey, the European Union, and I'm just kind of summarizing. I mean, NATO and some of these other nations, right, are just uh, relying on the U.S. for their military protection and resources and weapons and things of that nature. And so is the EU like self-sufficient in that way to be able, because I'm thinking like as you build like this type of infrastructure, resource security and things of that nature, you're going to need to secure it. And we've already seen like with Russia invading Ukraine and that conflict still going on or whatnot, and the many of these European Union nations haven't been able to do anything to really stop it. I guess they've given some weapons or whatnot. And so, how do you see that playing in the picture?
So, military is not something that I've been focused on,
Yeah.
but what was interesting to me is in November 2025, Trump released, I think it was over 40 pages, his national security strategy. I don't know if you ever had a chance to read that, but in it, 5 times he mentioned American elites' influence in US administrations over decades that have made poor decisions for the country. And I don't want to go conspiratorial,
Hmm.
but who would you think that he's talking about when he says American elites that have had influence? Well, my opinion is in 1949, the Rockefeller family donated the land for the United Nations in the United States. And that is considered anybody that does anything in a role there is granted diplomatic immunity. And it's incredible if you read the UN convention how anybody that does something there potentially criminal cannot be investigated for it at all, charged for it before, during, or after their time there. And so I think a lot of this really comes down to working with the United Nations to achieve some of these goals of central bank digital currencies, all of that. And it really revolves around the monetary system. Military is probably secondary to that. And I think this is where it really all stems from.
Okay. And so for people, like me, I would say you and I, we're trying to position our portfolios to with the ultimate goal of like self sovereignty and freedom and liberties, right? So what should we be thinking about? How should we be positioning? Uh, how does gold play in this picture? things of that nature. Could you speak to that?
That's an excellent question, and one that I actually am asked fairly often. And it's a little frightening because I'm giving a presentation this fall, and I'm already starting to think about what I'd like to speak about. And so far, I'm thinking the 1934 confiscation of gold, because anybody that thinks that that type of thing can't happen again, I think there's every intention of digital confiscation of assets. So if you listen to the BIS or the IMF, they talk about tokenizing our assets. So including home ownership, any asset, they're going to tokenize it. And so if they can tax you on things digitally, they will. And there's an organization that was set up by the United Nations called BRICOM. And again, the EU and China and the United Nations are all behind this. And it's a global digital tax agency. So
Mm.
if everything, goes to CBDCs, and we are kind of on a one world currency system that's digital, they can change your taxes here in Canada. Now, you wouldn't be exposed if you're in the United States. So it's very concerning for me. And I've had this discussion with my family a lot. And I think the only thing that you can do is diversify, spread your risk so that, heaven forbid these things happen, that, maybe you have money in another country, you buy physical metals and that kind of thing. But at the very least, I have said to people, please don't keep all of your portfolio in one institution, because I strongly suspect all these central bankers have repeatedly discussed a crisis, so that, it would take a crisis for us to accept this, because obviously none of us are going to be happy about going to central bank digital currencies. But I have always thought, what? In the event of a cyber attack, and that's actually something that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent mentioned in a recent speech, is the potential for a cyber attack having significant impact here. So if you keep all of your assets in one institution, not a good idea, in
Yeah.
my opinion. Yeah, I mean, I'm not giving financial advice, but just to mitigate your risk, I heard a cybersecurity expert say you should have your investments, your life savings spread amongst at least three different ones,
Hmm.
minimum three, and preferably eight, she said. So there was an instance where Israel hacked an Iranian bank, and actually wiped out all of the data from that bank. And this was in Reuters fact. And yeah, they had actually, this was the bank that paid the military for Iran. And there was no getting that data back, completely wiped out. So imagine if your bank, everything was wiped out. And that's why I've just been saying to people, just spread your risk as much as possible. I don't, I hope it doesn't come to pass, but if it does, it's unavoidable. And so I've been looking at the 1934 gold confiscation. And back then, you could have $100 worth of gold for each member of your family. And so that's what people would do, is they'd make sure, some was in their kid's name.
Hmm.
Okay, so
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and a lot of this is a house of cards. I mean, especially with the debt, fractional reserves, lending, derivatives, and I mean, even the book The Great Taking talks about like our stocks. Like we don't get the certificates anymore. Like and we don't have ownership of it and such. And so, yeah, definitely concerning things. Um, I was thinking about a point that you made with it was in regards to the cybersecurity, issue. I remember when was the name Klaus Schwab
Mhm.
of the World Economic Forum or the IMF or whatever. I think he was part of both. But when
Mhm.
he mentioned that if we had a cybersecurity pandemic, it would make COVID look like a mere inconvenience. And I remember that vividly when he said that. And that was something that, I've been kind of keeping in the back of my mind since he's mentioned that.
Mhm. It was interesting. So I listened to a lot of Henry Kissinger speeches, and he wrote a book in 2014 called World Order. And I really think that this is where all of this New World Order comes from. But Henry Kissinger was very much of the mindset that, when you're in government, morals aren't what matter. It's all about order and basically keeping your population in check. And so that's my fear. As crazy as it sounds, this is really where I think that we're headed. And
Mhm.
cyber attack, wiping out everything, as you said, it would be horrific. It would be much worse than COVID. Imagine that. If, in Canada, if we have very few major banks, but if two of them were wiped out and we lost everything, that would be the perfect way to implement something like UBI, be a central
Yeah.
bank digital currencies.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, I definitely got to have you back on because I'm curious in how Ray Dalio's work around changing world orders and such plays into this with global geopolitical monetary, which I think you covered some of this. So yeah, I definitely want to keep my finger on the pulse of that, and I'm sure the audience would appreciate that. So, Jennifer, where can the audience read some of your publications? And I know that you research companies that uh, extract minerals and things of that nature. And so, where can the audience connect with you?
If they go to, it's a long website name, my apologies, sandpipertradingcorporation.com. You can subscribe to my newsletter there, and I offer two different services, basic and premium. So you can, it explains that on the website. But premium subscribers will get access to my white paper reports. I do have one analyst with me that covers energy stocks, and I research junior exploration companies and publish papers on those. And at the end of every month, I think what makes me maybe a little different, I don't have companies pay me for coverage. I find these companies and research management because that's always my number one priority. And then I write about them. And at the end of every issue, I include a trade tracker. And I tell people when
Mhm.
I close my trades, just to see, it's been a tough quarter. Not going to lie about that. But yeah, I want to always be transparent and show people if I still believe in the company and why. And yeah, it's been a great experience. Just started that in January. So if people are interested
Yeah.
in subscribing, they can check out my website.
Yeah, and you gave us a few, company suggestions, back in November when you came on the show, and I actually did pretty well. I mean, Faraday Copper was one of those, and such, and obviously the whole market is being dragged down for many different reasons and such. But yeah, I mean, I definitely appreciate your research, and I mean, you even do some of that kind of investigative, work around these companies, like as you mentioned, Faraday Copper. You're like, oh yeah, the Lundin family and some other folks have come together and such, and that's important information for people to know, especially when they're considering some of these companies that they want to invest in. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate you for coming on the show. Definitely got to have you back. And you all be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't subscribed yet. Love to have your support. And thank you all for watching.